This is the issue that people complained about the most, and I bet you've not even heard of it before. Do you think that doesn't have an impact on criminal justice? Who gets to decide what is reasonable? Only to find out later you will not get paid for your time. It's insidious, and the data does not show that that national standard had any effect. Years later, it's still going on, and the fix is so easy. This is the biggest issue in criminal justice, at least according to the lawyers who actually work in criminal justice, who actually represent criminals themselves. So, I'm gonna go ahead and get into it. The judicial branch itself, right, under the guidance of the Supreme Court, established a committee to review the Criminal Justice Act and see if there were things in the Criminal Justice Act's implementation that could be improved. Now, as they performed this study and this review, interviewing people, collecting data, examining files and records and things like that, what they heard repeatedly, that most dissatisfaction was expressed in this particular aspect of the Criminal Justice Act and its implementation, right? So this is the issue that people complained about the most and the loudest, and I bet you've not even heard of it before. Kind of sad, but this is the world that we live in. Now I'm gonna take a little step back to kind of set the scene, right? So taking a step back, we're gonna go back to the forming of our great nation and the establishment of our Constitution and the laws that bind us, right? In the forming of the United States, we said we don't want any person above the law. And part of that is ensuring that if you are accused of some wrongdoing, you have the chance for a fair trial. You can look at the quote here and see, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial, right? So if you're accused, you have the right to your day in court, and you shouldn't have to wait forever and ever for that day in court to come. Sounds fair and reasonable. Although that's what the law says and how it was written 200 plus years ago, and that is a different time than the time we live in now. Back in that time, when this amendment was added to the Constitution, there were not full-time law enforcement people, right? There weren't just police in uniforms out on street corners making sure that people were going the speed limit, right? This is a very different time. Really, what would happen is if you were the victim of a crime, then it was kind of on you to begin the process for a trial, right? You had to say, I have been wronged and I would like a day in court to examine these wrongdoings. Now, the victims and the people who were accused would have to be their own representatives, and the jury of peers was often just the public, right? Now, the issue with that is that the common man is not getting the same training as a lawyer, and the common man maybe does not have the same financial backing that a wealthier man may have. And so when it comes to providing the best representation possible, or even what some would say is just a fair representation, money impacts things. And that is a common theme that you'll see. Money makes the world move round, as some people would say. So, thinking about this, and in particular, having the benefit of experience, right? The benefit of seeing how justice and trials were carried out over years and years and years, there began a growing movement to reform criminal justice. And that really gained steam, really got most popular during the time of the Civil Rights era. So, we're going to fast forward a little bit to 1964, right? When Criminal Justice Act was first passed, right? And what this did to try and right the wrongs of the past in terms of representation in court is it established a panel of local attorneys who would represent people and then be reimbursed for representing people in court. That way, even if you didn't have the ability to pay, didn't have the most money, you could still have access to a quality lawyer from your local community, and still get representation in court. To ensure that these lawyers weren't just going crazy and charging ridiculous rates and then the government reimbursed them, there was a system of limits put in place so that these lawyers would get paid, but they wouldn't get paid any ridiculous amounts, right? You gotta have some checks and balances in the system. And so that was what was established. Now, this was a little bit controversial because some people felt like these private attorneys being paid at these lower rates, at these set rates, would not attract the most high quality lawyers, right? If you have a lawyer who's going to come in and the most he can get paid is, let's say, $50 an hour, and then you have a case from a highfalutin company or a wealthy person or something like that where you can get paid up to $75 an hour, well, the high quality lawyers are going to go and chase the money for their time, right? Hey, if I'm quality, I want to get paid for my time, I want to get reimbursed the most that I can, and so why wouldn't I want to seek that out? So this idea of kind of taking on extra clients for set rates, it provided a system to help people, but it was also seen as not quite competitive with the larger market. And so there was an idea that this system needed to be changed and amended, right? And that's actually what we saw happen several years later, where in 1970, Congress amended the Criminal Justice Act, where they created a hybrid system. So, in creating this hybrid system, it established public defenders, right? These are lawyers who are salaried employees, right? They don't get paid on a per case basis. They're salaried, right? So they get paid on an annual basis, right? Every 2 weeks, their paycheck comes directly from the bank, right? Direct deposit into their accounts. So you have these attorneys on staff, right? You have attorneys on staff who are always there working to help represent people. And if they need additional help, or for some reason they can't get to a case, maybe a conflict of interest or something like that, then you also have these private attorneys who can fill in and help bridge the gap, right? So you got some set staff and then a capacity to surge a little bit more with these private panel attorneys. Sounds good, right? You know, progress, as they would say. You know, before it wasn't the Criminal Justice Act, now they see there needs to be some changes, and then in implementing the changes, took a look back and say, well, this wasn't quite as effective as what we wanted, so let's adjust things to make it a little bit better. All well and good. However, it gets to this point here where attorneys shall be reimbursed for expenses reasonably incurred, right? This is the language that applies when it comes to these private panel attorneys representing clients. And although this is clear and can be expressed in a nice quote, the one kind of hiccup that I don't know if you see looking at it is the reasonably incurred, right? Who gets to decide what is reasonable? That is the question. Getting back to where I started, once the Supreme Court established this committee to review the Criminal Justice Act, started listening to testimony from lawyers all across the country, what they heard again and again and again was that these lawyers, who were panel attorneys representing people and then asking to get reimbursed for the time they spent working the case, was that these attorneys were not getting paid for the time that they actually spent working, right? These attorneys would spend what they felt was a reasonable amount of time on the case. Then the decision would go to the judge to say, hey, me as the attorney, I worked 5 hours on this case. I like to get reimbursed for those 5 hours. The rates are already set, have been approved by Congress, so no arguing over that. But judge, it's up to you now to sign off on this so I can get paid. However, time and time again, these lawyers request to get paid for the work they already did was rejected and denied. Rejected and denied. So, how can you represent someone and do a good job working on their behalf only to find out later you will not get paid for your time? And the thing is, right, these lawyers work in particular districts around the country. And if you work in the same district, there's only a handful of judges in that district. And so if a judge rejects your reimbursement request, says, hey, you said you worked 5 hours, but I think it only should have taken you 4 hours, and so I'm only going to pay you for 4 hours. You'll remember that, and next time you're representing a client before that judge, it would be hard not to have that idea in your mind that, hey, I would like to do my best, I would like to put in the amount really needed to represent this person well, but last time and the time before and the time before, I didn't get paid. Do you really think that as the attorney, you're going to continue working your very best, doing the very most that you can to represent people when you know you won't get paid for your time? When you know that when you go to the judge who has to rule on the case, he says, no, your time wasn't that valuable? Do you think that doesn't have an impact on criminal justice? You think that doesn't have an impact on mounting an effective defense, on being innocent until proven guilty? It does have an effect. It's insidious, and this is the area that left most lawyers angry. This is what they talked about the most. This is what they themselves said was the biggest issue, and they have testimony on record in the thousands of hours and interviews and things like that. It's this area of reduction of compensation, right? And to use the slick terms that they use, right, to give you the insider terms, they call it voucher cutting, because these attorneys would represent a client and then have to fill out this little form that says, hey, this is how much time I spent doing this, how much time I spent doing that, and so this is the amount of money that I'd like to get reimbursed, right? You submit the form, they call it a voucher, and then when the judge looks at it and says, no, I'm not going to pay you all that, that's called the voucher being cut. So, I'm showing you a little map here of the country and how it's split up. The biggest thing I want to highlight with this slide here is just that our criminal justice system is very much a local one that flows into a national system, right? So there are local districts, often multiple districts within a state, and then many districts together fall under one appeals court, right? So it's like district court, appeals court, and then the higher level from the appeals court is the Supreme Court. So you start more local, then you get up to the more national, if need be. Hearing this testimony and feedback from lawyers who were complaining about not getting paid, the committee that was established to review the Criminal Justice Act and its implementation came up with recommendations, right? Recommendations that they submitted to say, hey, let's change these things so that we improve how criminal justice is carried out in the United States. And they made a couple of recommendations that very specifically tied back to this major issue of voucher cutting. First one I'm highlight here is adopt a standard for voucher review. I'm going to read this for you just so that we hone in on the key points here, right? So this first part of the recommendation. Adopt the following standards for voucher review. Voucher cuts should be limited to mathematical errors, instances in which work billed was not compensable, was not undertaken or completed, and instances in which the hours billed are clearly in excess of what was reasonably required to complete the task. So, basically, if there was a mistake in adding things up, yeah, fix that. If you said you did some work but you actually didn't, yeah, we're not going to pay you for that. If it's very obvious that the hours are way beyond what was needed, we're not going to pay you for that, but otherwise you get paid. That's what this first part says, right? The first part of this recommendation. The second part says, okay, get together with the Defender Services Committee and provide a guide for what should be reimbursed and what shouldn't be. So make it more clear what these lawyers should get paid for and what they should not get paid for. These were the two recommendations. Make it more clear over what should get paid and what shouldn't. And then for the stuff that really shouldn't get paid, math errors, work that wasn't done, or just ridiculous overreaches, then definitely don't pay people for those. Very reasonable, right? Reasonable recommendations to help with the implementation of the Criminal Justice Act, to help fix the biggest issue according to the lawyers who actually work representing these defendants. Now, although those recommendations are well and good, here we get into the data, right? My favorite part, right? I, myself, am a data analyst and some, I dabble in a whole bunch of different things now, but I was a data analyst that worked for the Defender Services organization. I also worked for Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of the Treasury, Department of Transportation. So I have a lot of experience in government. I've seen things from the inside, and in this case, I got to see the data from each of the districts around the country and how often the judges in these districts were cutting lawyers' vouchers, right? How often these judges were saying, yeah, you said you worked 5 hours, but I'm not going to pay you for those 5 hours. And what you see in looking at the data is outliers, right? All these little tiny dots close to zero, which means that many districts around the country, when the lawyer says, hey, I worked 5 hours, 99+% of the time, the judge says, okay, good. Very reasonable. However, in a few districts around the country, including the very worst district, about 75% of the time, as you can see in the graph, a lawyer will say, hey, I worked these hours, and the judge says, I'm not going to pay you that much, right? This ends up undermining the entire criminal justice system, because the entire criminal justice system was established so that you get quality representation even if you don't have the ability to pay, right? That it's a common good that's coming out of all of our tax dollars, because we may all be accused and want the benefit of quality representation behind us, and we don't feel like being poor means that you should be doomed to no attorney or a low quality attorney, right? So the data here very clearly shows that some of these dots are sticking out to the far right, which means that in those districts, the judges are rejecting lawyers' requests for fair compensation at rates that are many, many times higher than what's going on in the rest of the country. Now, you're probably looking at this and wondering, wait, well, when did this data come out? Was this before those recommendations, right before the fixes? Or was this after the fixes? And this is data from after the recommendations were put out, right? After there was more clear guidance put out across the country about what should be paid and what should not. After there was more clear guidance that unless it's a math error or work wasn't actually done, or that it was just a ridiculous exaggeration and over-the-top BS, that lawyers should get paid. Even with this more clear definition, right, these more clear rules, it did not change how people were acting in a significant way. A quote directly from the report that looked at what happened when these recommendations were implemented. The data do not support the expectation that a national standard would reduce any inconsistent voucher reduction practices. So we put out a national standard about what should be allowed and not allowed when it comes to paying these attorneys, and the data does not show that that national standard had any effect, right? What that means is that there are some judges around the country who are rejecting lawyers' requests to get paid reasonable amounts. The rates that these lawyers get paid are already set by Congress, but these judges are taking it upon themselves to say, no, you don't get to work that hard for your client. Even when there is a more clear national standard establishing what is okay for these lawyers, these judges are still saying, no, I will not pay you that amount. This is the insidious underbelly of the criminal justice system that no one is talking about, and that years later is still going on. The thing is, the fix is so easy. It doesn't just take me being the guy who ran these numbers, right? Who saw these statistics and figures from the inside, from when I was actually working in government, right? Now I'm on the outside. I can be a little bit more free. I can say what I want. I'm ready to face the backlash. Come at me, bro. I'm here. The easy fix is not the national standard, right? I love the idea of let's get together, convene a committee, provide some recommendations, follow up on these recommendations. However, by this committee's own admission, the recommendations did not have a significant impact on the data, right? What you thought would be the fix did not work. You should have chosen the easy option, right? If you want to make things more fair, then there needs to be more accountability. Instead of having anonymous data about which districts our lawyers are really not getting paid in, we need to free the data, release the information. I have seen this. I know what districts are being hit the hardest, but I also respect the rules of the government that I worked under, and so I'm not going to just release it by myself, right? I'm not going to whistleblow because the government should just be making this public anyways, right? Instead of me going behind their back and just releasing it, what I'm doing instead is going to the public and saying, help me get this information out here. Subscribe to this channel, follow this video, share this video so that we can actually do something in this criminal justice reform, right? This is the biggest issue, the thing that lawyers complain about the most, the thing that affects them doing their job the most. And the fix is so easy, right? When we can clearly identify, hey, it is this district and this state with these judges who are impacting how people are getting represented, then the fix is very easy. We can go to those judges in particular and say, You judge, why are you not doing this, right? The national standard is already out there, and there was already guidance even before the recommendations to come and provide additional guidance, right? The rules were already set, and for most districts in the country, this actually wasn't that big of a problem. But in some districts, it's huge. It's massive. It's all the time. There are some judges out there who refuse to pay lawyers for the work that they are doing, and it's undermining our entire system. We need to make this data public so that we can hold our government accountable. This isn't a political thing, right? You've not heard me say Democrat or Republican, left or right, conservative or progressive in this entire video, because I really do not care. I care about making the data public, and then when people can see what government is really doing, they will hold government accountable in the way that it should be. I trust in the people. I trust that after you have seen this video, you will share it with others. And I trust that I will continue putting out more videos, exposing more of these simple fixes to government problems, and showing how the solutions are easy, nonpartisan, but need your support. So, thank you. I appreciate your attention, and I wish you the very best. Take care.